All right, so, sorry. Oh. All right, hi guys. I know there was a bit of a schedule change. Unfortunately, the speaker had to swap with me. So I'm Erika Noerenberg. I'll be talking about some Mac malware today. I work for Carbon Black in the threat analysis unit. So today I'm just gonna give a little introduction, and then I want to talk about how it all started, how we found this, the process that we went through. Then we're going to go into a little bit of technical analysis of the malware, and I want to talk a little bit about detection and prevention because this is so prevalent, and then we'll have some time for question and answers. So who am I? I've been in the security industry for a while doing digital forensics, malware reverse engineering, some firmware analysis back in the day, and some iOS programming. I've been at Carbon Black 1 year as of this week. So actually a year ago I was speaking here for Carbon Black for the first time. I was also a forensic analyst and reverse engineer at DC3, the Defense Cybercrime Center, in investigating defense network intrusions. So let's talk about how this all started. When I was starting to put together this talk, I was thinking about the malware and going into the technical analysis and all this, and I was like, you know, that's really interesting, but it was actually kind of more interesting, the whole journey that we got there over the last 6 months. So I'm going to talk about that a little bit more, because we found out about this in November of last year, and it was a long journey of discoveries, some mistaken assumptions, and rabbit holes, because if you do malware analysis or any sort of intel stuff, you always go down rabbit holes and end up, sometimes you get something at the end and sometimes it's a dead end. So, back in November of last year, my coworker, I'm sitting, just sitting on the couch in the evening, having a Manhattan with my husband, watching a movie, whatever. My phone lit up with a Slack notification from my coworker, Jimmy. And he's an avid home brewer. So he said, he was searching for this new stout recipe. And I'm sorry, this is kind of small. I was expecting it to be a little bit more visible, but basically he sent me a message and said, I was looking for this stout recipe, and this forum site took me to a Flash update that I think is malware. And so I was like, great, that sounds awesome. Let's look at it. And so I started looking into the website, and in January, so we were, I skipped a lot there. Wow, okay. Okay. Anyway, in January, we'd been looking at it for a while, and I was like, oh my god, I think this is Windtail, because I'd been looking into Windtail malware. And it's basically an APT malware for Mac that bypasses Gatekeeper. And so there was this article by Phil Stokes from Sentinel-1, and he was talking about this. And he included a screenshot of a script that looked so much like this one that I had seen. I was like, oh my god, Jimmy, we found something really interesting. So this was the script that I found. This was the one that, from what I had seen, it was this odd 799.com marsupials.zip. Looking into it further, I found kittens.zip and elephants.zip, and there are all these zips. And it was just a very simple bash script, basically, that pulled down this zip file, unzipped it, and installed it with open. Nothing too sophisticated. So this was his article, and you can see this was almost verbatim the same thing that I had seen. And this one was kittens.zip, which I also found. But basically it was just the installer, it was a fake Flash installer as well. It wasn't actually an app, it was just a command. So it was just basically, it looked like you were installing an app, but really behind the scenes it was just this player.command bash script. It had an application icon, but when you actually clicked on it, it was really just running this bash script. And pulled down the payload, the second payload, via curl. Typical system utility on Macs. So down the rabbit hole I went. I was like, wow, I hope these aren't all adware, because, there was this thing in this Windtail article, maybe it's something more sophisticated, maybe this is going to lead to something bigger. So my coworker Greg Foss said, hey, why don't we've got this site, double docs, double like the beer. This is a beer site, homebrewer forum. So he wrote some Python using Selenium to basically scrape the, try to automate collecting these samples. So it would go to the site. There were a series of redirects. So this script would go through these redirects, detect when there was a payload that was finally displayed to the user, that was this flash update. And then it would, whenever it found the site, it would pull down the URL, take a screenshot, get the source of the page, and the payload. So we collected several, just off the very front, we were able to pull down several samples. However, this was January. Back in November, the site was not very sophisticated. You could just keep hitting it and pulling more stuff down. So initially back in November, I'd pulled down probably like 6 or 7 samples just to see what it was. Now in January, they had gotten a little bit smarter and ended up detecting if the same IP was hitting multiple times within a certain time period. So what Greg did was set up a rotating proxy so that he could connect to different VPNs, have different like rotating IP addresses to try to pull down samples without notifying the website that this was the same person. And this worked pretty well for a while. So here we are. We're like, man, we found all this really cool stuff, right? We're like, we got to name this thing because nobody's ever seen it before. This is really exciting. The best and worst part, malware analysis. Like, it's always like, well, what are we going to name this thing? So the original site that we had seen was double docs, double like the beer, D-U-B-B-E-L. And we had been in this hot debate in our Slack channel at work about IPAs, because I'm sure all of you know, a lot of people have severe, very, very strong opinions about IPAs. Most people hate them. My coworker, Brian Baskin, who may or may not be in here, but he's one of the conference staff, was going on a rant about how much he hated IPAs. So I was like, well, why don't we call it double IPA? And yes, I know doubles don't have anything to do with IPAs, but I just wanted to mess with them. So double IPA was born. We made a whole Slack channel for it. You know, we were going crazy. This was so exciting. And then I found Schlayer. I was like, oh, man, I guess we're going to have to call this thing Schlayer. There's the article. So this was Intego researchers in February of 2018, 1 year prior, had actually researched this and found all the things that I'd been finding. I was like, ah, bummer, right? So, bummed. Can't use a double IPA name. But our boss actually said, why don't we just keep double IPA and make it like a campaign identifier? Like, it's still Schlayer, but, you know, it's the double IPA campaign or something, just so we can use it. But it was pretty clear that this was an ongoing thing, you know, for the past year. So, like, all right, I'm just gonna have to call it Schlayer. So, let's look a little bit into the technical details. Now that you have a bit of the backstory. So what is it? Like I said, in February, January, they posted this article in February, but they initially discovered it back in 2018. We found our samples in November, as I said. We didn't know what the family was at the time. We didn't have a whole lot of time, resources to devote to it, so I was kind of keeping up with it, hitting it every once in a while. I looked in December a little bit, looked in January. We didn't really think a whole lot of it, because it's like, well, it's, you know, adware. We found this one site. But then I started poking at VirusTotal and seeing that basically on a daily basis, there were hundreds of these being uploaded. Each time it was one sample. There was one submission for each of these, all of these hashes. So we saw an uptick back in February 2019 when we started looking at actual customer data. It's like, okay, this is actually getting serious. We need to look at this a little bit more. And when I actually started digging into the malware, I noticed that there was a kind of a unique privilege escalation technique that one thing, it was not identified in the MITRE attack framework, which my coworker Jimmy had been doing a lot of attack work. And so we thought that was pretty interesting. And we actually ended up submitting it to MITRE. And it doesn't have an ID assigned yet, but it was accepted, so it should be in the next version of the framework. So back to Greg's collection script. We did this initially. It was working great. But the malware authors started getting a little bit smarter. So in addition to just detecting IP addresses, they were detecting IP ranges. And so we were VPN hopping, still working a little bit. But they started kind of redirecting to this dummy site that was www9.doubledocs.com. So we're like, okay, how do we get around this? So he modified his script to detect when this www9 site came up and said, okay, we're going to back off, we're going to sleep for a while, we're going to switch IP, switch VPNs, switch countries, sleep for a few minutes, and try again. So again, this worked pretty well. Right away we got 15, within like probably a couple hours, we got 15 unique samples. So there were a lot of, I know you can't see this, but there were a lot of duplicate hashes that came out, but they were also served from different sites with different names. But like I said, in the probably, 25, I can't see it, 20-something hashes, there were 15 that were unique. So we started digging into those again. So I just wanted to see if this will work. No, that's not going to work. Okay. Actually, I don't know how to play that. Let's see if we can just move this. No. Well, anyway, so if you go to doubledocs.com right now, this is actually the www9 site. You can probably tell, even though it's kind of blurry probably, you've seen these things before. When you go, maybe you mistype a domain or something, and there's this squatter that's got this like fake search site or whatever. So basically it was getting redirected to this. So we're like, okay, we need to adjust this. So I started modifying the script and trying to see if we could, get around this. But they had actually started putting captchas in. So it was like, you have to click, am I human? That kind of thing. And they started moving the payloads around. So the Selenium script wasn't working to download the payloads anymore, unfortunately. So again, like I said, the distribution, we found it on this homebrewing site, but there were tons of hijacked domains that they were using to serve out these ads. And what it seems like, what it seemed like at the time was that basically when a domain would expire, they would squat on it and be able to hijack them to use it as a redirect to other ad sites. So some of these would have 5 or 6 redirects until you get to the final payload. So for the most part, these were fake Adobe Flash installers. It's very common. I don't know why people are still installing Flash, but also some browser extensions. Usually they were DMGs or packages. We saw ISOs and zip files. And a lot of them, if you look in VirusTotal, a lot of them are in torrent files for, cracked Photoshop or cracked software. And they're bundled in there. Some of them actually do finally install the software, like the real Flash. Some of them don't even bother. So lately, like last week, I was trying to look at this DoubleDocs again, and now it just keeps redirecting me to the dummy site, so it's not working anymore. So I took a look at the page source just out of curiosity, and I noticed this parkingcrew.net. I was like, well, what is parkingcrew.net? It was using all this CSS from there. It turns out it's this domain parking platform that advertisers use for this exact purpose. So it seems to be using that to distribute over these ad networks and things like that. Not something I had really looked at before, but apparently there are things called domainers that actually just specialize in this. So a lot of money in it, I guess. So this one I thought was really interesting. This is one example of the sites that you would be redirected to. So you can see that it's actually detecting, what your OS version is so that it can customize this page for the user, make it look a little bit more believable. This one is you're infected, start a scan, download our software kind of thing. But the thing I thought was interesting was this is the only custom part of this page. They actually mirrored all of these links are the actual Buy AppleCare link. It'll take you to the Mac store. These will take you to, all of the Apple sites, the legitimate Apple sites. So only this piece right here is actually the malware, or from the malicious, the content, which, just makes it a little bit, from a social engineering perspective, makes it a little bit more believable to the user. So here's just a sample of some of the many, many different sites. So you can see, like, all of these things. These are all just, the various ways that it distributes this. All of those flash updates are the same, well, not same hashes, but they're all these malicious Schlayer packages. But they display it in a different way to the user, depending on which site you get redirected to, right? And then some of them are these actual Chrome extensions that it'll display. The funny thing is, so here's one of the Chrome extensions, and at first I thought, whatever, it's just taking you to this is just a different redirect or something. It's just taking you to this Chrome extension page to add it for whatever reason. And then I noticed, oh wait, that's actually just a window on top of the malicious site. So this is the actual legitimate thing from the Chrome store, but it's sitting on top of the double docs site. So I thought that was pretty funny. And some of these samples had some JavaScript that were bundled in and had a crypto mining component. So this is actually just showing you before and after the crypto miner was installed. So you can see, like, the CPU usage goes, skyrockets. There's my friend Adam, my former coworker, in the audience somewhere. So he hit me up the other day. He actually left us, and we're trying to he's going to come back. I know you're going to come back. But he was searching himself in Google, and he's like, hey, take a look at this link down here. I was like, oh, look at that. I clicked on it, and sure enough, took me to another Schlayer site. So another coworker, Casey, had hit me up a couple of times. He's like, yeah, I was searching for, Python 7-zip extract. And, the third result was this funny site. I went to it, and it's like trying to serve me a fake Flash update. So somehow they've infiltrated the ad network. I guess they're, paying for Google AdWords or something like that. But it's funny that it's legitimate searches. It's not searching for anything interesting. I tried to figure out a way to, kind of automate this and try to detect these, but it's really like 1 in a million. We just happened to, over the last few months, stumble on 4 or 5 of them, of these Google searches that pop up this site. So let's look at one of the executions, like how this actually works. So I'm going to take one sample that is an example of a DMG version. They all pretty much, after the first stage, they all pretty much work the same. This one in particular creates a hidden directory with a .command script, which is similar to the article, the initial article from Phil Stokes. So after this stage, some of them are an actual app where it goes through an installer, but this one in particular was basically just a bash script. After that, it's pretty much the same functionality. Basically, you have a first script that decodes and decrypts another script. That script decodes another embedded script. And the third script is the one that actually does the download of the final stage payload. So it'll actually download it, download the zip, extract the zip, and open up the final installer. The privileges, it actually uses sudo and some techniques that we'll talk about in a little bit. The important thing, though, the interesting thing, is that all of these payloads, every single one of these, and I'm talking hundreds a day, hundreds of new ones, if you look in VirusTotal, every single one of them signed with a valid developer ID, valid certificate. I actually did talk with Apple support. We had it back and forth, and they've been revoking certificates pretty quickly. So it will like neuter this thing, but at the time they weren't revoking any of the actual developer IDs. So we had one that I looked into. I started just like scraping all of these developer IDs. I got to like 70 and I'm like, this is ridiculous. And so one of them was like Maxwell Brooklyn. So all of them were kind of like, if you're familiar with domain generation algorithms, kind of in a similar way. So that would, generate random domain names. They had something where it would generate a random name. So sometimes you'll see like a weird name that has a last name for a first name, you know, and they all look very suspicious. But this guy, Maxwell Brooklyn, had been signing these things for over a year at this time. So I'm like, okay, there's definitely something wrong here. And so now, since then, since probably about February, they've actually started revoking some of these developer IDs as well. But, you know, it's a total, cat and mouse game. You know, you can't, they can only, you know, keep up with these things. They're just continually generating. So hopefully now that they've got, Apple has started, what is it called? They've, notarization. So they've implemented notarization that I think is going to be required for 10.15. Any apps that are running on 10.15 will have to be notarized by Apple, which is another step of verification, basically. So hopefully that'll mitigate some of this. So let's take a look at the first encoded script. Unfortunately, this is going to be a little bit hard to see. I was hoping it'd be a little bit bigger, but I'll tell you what's going on here. Basically, you've got this encoded and encrypted bit, and there's an eval where it has OpenSSL, XXD, AES. Basically, it's going to base64 decode first, and then SSL decrypt using this password that's here. And this password I'll talk about a little bit later, but basically it's hard-coded per sample. And when I first started looking at this, I actually, a former coworker of mine, after I posted the initial kind of notification of it to our customers, he said, hey, I've been tracking this for a while also. I've got like 5,300 samples, and I think that this password is actually based on kind of a timestamp thing. And so I kind of started looking into that as well. And you will see that this number increases. So it's some sort of, you know, timestamp type of, I guess, tracking that they're using. But the artifacts down here, this is just an example of CB response, but you would, you know, any sort of endpoint thing, or like if you run any sort of like process tool, you'll see the child processes of bash. You've got base64 here, user bin base64, and user bin OpenSSL. So you'll see those each time. And this is important, as I'll talk later about the detection. So this second script that gets decoded by that first one is going to, you've got another section of base64 code here. It's going to base64 decode that, and then it uses XXD. If you're not familiar with XXD, it's a command line hex editor that's on most Unix and BSD-based systems. It's just basically a command line hex editor that you can use to dump or modify or manipulate hex. So they use this to format and write out the third and final script. So this third script is the one that's it kind of mimics that initial bash script that we saw. This particular sample is kind of one of the more sophisticated ones that has some more layers of obfuscation. But basically, when it comes down to it, these are all the same. At the end, you've got a curl command where it basically will pull down the payload that's a zip. It's a password-protected zip. The password, again, is hard-coded into these scripts. So both the password for the zip and the password for the decryption are both hard-coded. And these curl, you can't see it here, but the curl command line arguments are also interesting. It's -F0L, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But this ended up turning out to be a very good behavioral indicator that was high fidelity for detecting Schleyer, very specifically. So let's just take a look at one of these URLs. Basically, for each URL, you have a C equals, which we're calling it like a campaign identifier. This one is not unique. So we did some analytics on, you know, frequency of each campaign identifier. Not a lot came out of it, but we couldn't really find any sort of correlation. We were thinking maybe at first this is indicating like who it's targeting or something, but we just didn't have enough data to really say that there was anything really there. We've got a U equals, which this is actually a unique ID that's for the victim system. It's based on the IO platform UUID. So basically they just run some system commands, generate a UUID that they put into this URL for tracking again. We've got an S equals, which is a session ID, and this is just a straight UUID gen command, just the output of that. We've got the O is the Mac OS version, so it actually has the full version and the patch level, so 10.12.5 in this example. And then that encryption key. So it's B equals, and there's that encryption key that we saw in the very first sample. They actually pass that into this URL, again, probably for tracking of some sort. And given that it's based on a timestamp, maybe they're using that for, tracking campaigns. I don't know. So let's look at this again a little bit more in detail. Unfortunately, you can't really see this very well, but this just shows, I used a screenshot from our CB defense thing because you can see the whole, if you could actually see this, you can see the whole, all the artifacts for each execution of this command. But basically this shows the curl command and the particular URL that was used. And up here, if you could read it, you could actually see it says this is has a valid certificate and it's signed by like Becky Mayhem or something like that. But it actually, it checks the cert and you can actually see that they are validly signed. So this privilege escalation I said I was going to talk about a little bit more. It actually uses this security auth trampoline, which is used in this kind of unique privilege escalation technique that is talked about. You can't really see it, but the after effect of this, it's a security auth trampoline is set UID root. So the UID command is actually called as kind of a artifact of that. And this is another thing that is a pretty high fidelity behavioral indicator for this because it's not something that's commonly seen in environments from the research that we've done. So this security auth trampoline set UID is actually part of a call to this deprecated API called authorization execute with privileges. So this was actually deprecated by Apple many years ago because it's unsafe. The problem is people still use it because the secure replacement that they put in is very difficult to implement. And so most software developers have just stuck with this authorization execute with privileges. Unfortunately, it's very vulnerable to this privilege escalation technique where they can basically authorize with sudo. It does actually require the user to authenticate, but like we said, most of these things are an installer package. So the user is expecting to install Flash. The user is used to having to authenticate when doing an installation, so don't think too much of it. Problem is once this is actually executed and authenticated, everything after that is basically kind of whitelisted past gatekeeper. So it can, once it gets root, it's on the system and it can literally download and install anything else it wants. This screenshot is actually from a very, very good talk by Patrick Wardle. If you're not familiar with him, he's a Mac OS researcher. And his talk is up on YouTube. I definitely recommend it. It was from DEF CON 25. It's called Death by 1,000 Installers, and you can find it on YouTube, on his YouTube channel. Actually on the DEF CON YouTube channel. But I definitely recommend it. It's very interesting. So, lastly, I wanted to talk a little bit about the detection. I have to talk about attack because, it's the hotness. So, we had, some of these techniques. Like I said, we've got this privilege escalation technique that's based on this authorization execute with privileges API call. And MITRE will be adding that to the attack framework. Defense evasion and discovery. Again, this was the death by 1,000 installers. You can see this Flash Player installer does actually require the user to authenticate here. And again, we see the artifact of this. This is security auth trampoline that's being executed here by the malware. So the behavioral indicators I kind of touched on a little bit. The problem with this malware is, like I said, if you just look in VirusTotal, and I came up with a very good high-fidelity search on VirusTotal based on these behavioral indicators, because now with VirusTotal you can actually just say behavior, now that they've got the sandbox stuff implemented. You can say behavior, OpenSSL, like with command line arguments and things like that. So you can actually look for these things. And there are so many hashes every day because they're basically, my theory is that, they're uploading one sample for every one of these hashes and just hitting them against these antivirus engines until they say, okay, we've got too many detections. We got to flip this, put a new cert on it, new developer ID, flip up the hash, so that we've got a new hash, we've got new certs. The certs have been, killed or whatever. Because when this malware actually executes, one of the things that it does in the final stage, before it actually finishes installing, it will run spctl, which is a command that you can use to check the cert of a given binary. And so it'll actually run this spctl and say, okay, is my cert still valid? If it's not, I'm going to die. Kill it. So if the cert's not valid, it's not going to go through with installation, because then it's going to be picked up by the operating system and the security controls that are built into Mac. But anyway, so like we saw in the scripts before, though, we've got XXD, pretty common. If you run a search across your environment for XXD, if you've got developers, they're probably maybe using these in scripts. They may be using it at the command line. Pretty common. OpenSSL, again, any sort of admin tools, if you've got, sysadmins are probably using these in some automation scripts or things like that for certs and whatnot. Pretty common. Curl, again, not as common, but, a lot of developers still use that. UID, very uncommon as an actual child process. And security auth trampoline. How often is security auth trampoline actually loaded as a module from AppleScript from a user writable location? Those things are very uncommon, that combination. And the actual combination of curl and OpenSSL, or the combination of these three things together, curl by itself or OpenSSL or XXD by itself may not be a very good indicator. You combine these behaviors into one, and it's very uncommon. So we decided, hey, let's actually take a look. Let's just take curl. So how often is curl used across, this is millions of computers. Again, think about each of these squares is like one set of computers, and the color is what percentage of the computers in that group are running curl, just curl by itself. So the process name, just the process name curl, that's it. Again, in the enterprise setting, you're going to see this a lot with developers. If we take this, and like I said, again, the unique command line arguments of -f and then 0l, you narrow it down to that, and we've got that. Hardly ever used. In the endpoints that we actually looked at, every single one of these, except for one, I think it was a VAST, there was one case of an antivirus agent downloading a package update or something like that. But everything else was all Schleyer, every single one of them. So these command line arguments, the F is fail silently, probably not too uncommon, right? 0, though, use HTTP 1.0. Why would somebody want to downgrade HTTP using curl? Legitimately. Why would they bother, right? Not very common. And then -L, another uncommon one, is follow redirects. So the combination of these alone, I mean, this is a very simple combination here. Curl with the command line arguments of -F0L, and it was extremely high fidelity for identifying Schlayer across all of our endpoints. So this just gives you an idea, because, a lot of IOC stuff is focused on let's ban hashes or domains and things like that. But there are so many hashes on a daily basis, new hashes that are developed for this, you can't chase them. You're never going to be successful. So you really have to focus on these the unique behavioral indicators. So what's the takeaway here? Basically, Gatekeeper and XProtect, great security controls on Mac, but they're not going to protect you from something that's executed by the user. They're signed installers, so they're not going to pop up that thing, this is by a known developer or unknown developer, you're going to have to change your security settings to run this. No, they're signed. So it's going to get past that. The user thinks nothing of it. Adobe Flash, sure, it's from a signed developer. But do you really need Flash this day and age? Probably not, most cases. If you really have to, though, you can make sure that it's downloaded from Adobe and check the cert. It's easy to check the certs from the command line on Mac OS. You can very easily run one command and say, yep, this was actually signed by Adobe Systems. This is a legitimate executable or installer. There's a huge network of hijacked domains and websites. Like I said, we started chasing all of these domains, like all of the ones that we were pulling from all these samples that we were finding, and it was rotating. And there were just countless numbers of these. Also, and in the evolution of this, what we started seeing in February is that they were actually hosting all the final payloads on Amazon AWS. So try blacklisting that in your environment, right? S3.amazon? Yeah, no. So, you're not going to get around blocking these domains when the final payload is hosted someplace legitimately. How they're getting away with that still, I don't know. So like I said, hash and domain-based IOCs are of limited use. You got to rely on these behavioral indicators. So I wanted to put these links up. Unfortunately, it's kind of small, but I can post these up on Twitter, or I'll put a link to them after the talk. But I wanted to open it up for any sort of questions or comments or, whatever. Anybody have any questions?
What are you drinking?
Lemonade. Who said that? Yeah, okay. I love my coworkers, even the former ones. Anybody else? Yeah, so we're actually there is one of the things up here, so I'll just actually mention this. So the first three, Patrick Wardle, Death by 1,000 Installers, definitely recommend it if you're interested in Mac security. Well, pretty much anything that he does. The original Schlayer blog post were the Intego researchers. And then Phil Stokes wrote a really good article just basically on how Mac malware can bypass Gatekeeper in general. We have our threat intelligence notification. It's just a very short overview of what the malware is. If you're actually a Carbon Black user for some reason or and want more information like specific to the product, our user exchange there's more information on that than on the public blog post. And then we also, Greg wrote a CBR command line parser for this. We've got a GitHub page, our TAU, TAU tools GitHub page on our Carbon Black GitHub. And he actually wrote a script that if you have this in your environment and you happen to be running CBR, it'll actually, go out and pull it all and actually mitigate it for you. So all of those, the IOCs and scripts and stuff are all up on our GitHub. There will be a little bit bigger blog post coming out shortly after this that goes into a little bit more of the detail that I mentioned today. So, any more questions? Yeah.
Are you thinking this is like one bad actor, or this is something that they've commercialized and they're selling to lots of people?
Yeah, so he said, is this one bad actor, or is this something that's commercialized and they're selling to a lot of people? Unfortunately, I don't have the resources for the intel to actually determine that kind of thing. But given the widespread nature of it, I think it's probably commoditized. You know, I don't have any like dark web access or anything like that, but I would guess that because of the ad networks that they're using, that parkingcrew.net and things like that, they've probably monetized this and selling it to people. Just the sheer expanse of how rampant this is, and we're still seeing customers being hit on a daily basis with this, daily. So yeah. Any other questions? Okay. Well, thanks.